The call came on a Tuesday morning, right between my training schedule and a half-finished cup of coffee. A man's voice introduced himself as a lawyer and said the words I never expected to hear: "Colonel Robert Marshall has passed away." For a second, I couldn't breathe. Not because I loved him, because I didn't know how to feel anything at all. The lawyer continued calmly, like he was reading weather updates, not breaking a life open. He said my father requested my presence at the reading of his will. I almost laughed at the irony. My father had ignored my existence for 16 years, and now he wanted an audience. I told myself I wouldn't go. But my hands were already packing before my pride could catch up. Something inside me needed to see the truth with my own eyes: who he became, what he left behind, and why his name still had power over my heartbeat. On the bus ride to his city, memories came like flashes from a film I didn't choose to watch. My father's voice. My mother's silence. The way our home used to feel like a place where laughter was a mistake. When I was 5, my father was already a rising officer, disciplined, admired, and impossible to live with. Dinner was quiet, rules were everywhere, and affection felt like a reward you had to earn. My mother tried to soften him, but he only hardened more. The fights started small: tone, money, his absence. Then they grew into storms that shook the walls. I remember hiding behind the couch, pressing my hands over my ears, wondering if love always sounded like shouting. The day we left, my mother packed 2 suitcases and told me to hold my stuffed animal tight. My father stood at the doorway like a statue, arms crossed, jaw locked, pride stronger than grief. He didn't chase us. He didn't call that night. And after that, he became a story people avoided telling. My mother never poisoned me against him. She simply built a life where we could breathe again. She worked late, paid bills with tired hands, and still found a way to smile at my school plays like the world wasn't heavy. Years later, I heard he remarried. Her name was Stephanie, beautiful, flashy, always dressed like she was going to a party. People said she married the uniform, not the man inside it. They never had children, and my father never mentioned me to anyone who mattered to him. I tried to hate him. Hate would have been simple. But the truth was uglier: he was a stranger who still shaped the outline of my life. I joined the military not to follow him, but to reclaim what he had twisted: discipline without cruelty, strength without control. By the time I was 21, I had learned how to stand straight even when my heart shook. My mother called me her miracle, and I pretended not to tear up. Then the lawyer's call came, and the past knocked on my door like it still had a key. The city where my father lived smelled like polished stone and expensive silence. The law office was on a clean street with tall buildings and no warmth. I walked in wearing my best uniform, not for him, for myself. The waiting room was quiet, and then I saw her. Stephanie looked like she stepped out of a magazine: perfect hair, perfect coat, perfect coldness. Her eyes ran over me like I was a stain on a white carpet. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't offer condolences. She just said, "So you're the daughter," as if the word tasted bitter. I answered politely, because respect is a habit I trained into my bones. Mr. Carter greeted us with the neutral face of someone paid to carry secrets. He offered water, chairs, and a gentle tone. Then he said, "Before we read the will, there is context your father asked me to share." My father had been diagnosed with a terminal illness at the peak of his career. According to the lawyer, the diagnosis hit him harder than any battlefield ever could. The uniform that made him feel untouchable suddenly meant nothing against a calendar with an ending. The lawyer said my father spoke about regret, late at night, after appointments. He admitted he built his life like a fortress: strong walls, no doors. And when illness entered, he discovered how lonely a fortress feels when you're dying inside it. Stephanie interrupted sharply, "He talked to you about me too, I assume." Her smile looked rehearsed. Mr. Carter nodded and said, "He spoke about what happened at home." The air changed. Even she seemed briefly afraid of what truth sounded like. I didn't know the details, but I could imagine them. A sick man, a woman who loved comfort more than commitment, and a home that turned into a battlefield without medals. My father had once made our home feel like a barracks. Now life returned the lesson to him. Mr. Carter opened a file and said, "Your father revised his will 3 times." Stephanie's eyes narrowed. Mine widened. 3 times meant intention, careful, deliberate, final. The reading began with formal language, property lists, accounts, and polite phrases about service and honor. Stephanie slowly relaxed, as if money was the only grief she knew how to feel. I stayed still, waiting for the moment that would explain why I had been summoned after 16 years of silence. Then the lawyer's voice changed. "To my daughter, Sarah Marshall," he read, "whom I failed as a father but never stopped thinking about, I leave the primary residence, the majority of my savings, and the remainder of my service benefits." For 1 second, the room forgot how to breathe. Stephanie stood up so fast her chair screeched. "That's impossible. I'm his wife." Her voice cracked, not with sadness, but with rage. Mr. Carter didn't argue, he simply continued, "Because paper doesn't care about tantrums." The next line hit like a quiet thunder. "To my former wife, Claire, who raised our daughter alone and did the work I refused to do, I leave." Stephanie's face went pale. My mother's name and his will felt like a confession carved into stone. Stephanie accused me of manipulation, of plotting, of stealing. I hadn't spoken 10 words in that room, but she built a whole fantasy where I was the villain. And I realized something: people who only understand power are terrified when they lose it. Mr. Carter said the will was airtight. He reminded her that her husband was a colonel, not a fool, and he documented everything. Stephanie's lips pressed into a thin line, the kind you see right before someone decides to become dangerous. After the reading, the lawyer handed me a sealed envelope. My name was written on it in neat handwriting that pulled me straight into childhood. "He asked me to give you this alone," Mr. Carter said gently, and for the first time his voice sounded human. I waited until I was outside to open it. My fingers trembled, not from fear, from the weight of a man finally speaking after years of silence. The first line stole the air from my lungs: "Sarah, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking anyway." He wrote that he had been a good soldier and a terrible father. He admitted he confused obedience with love and control with protection. He said shame kept his mouth closed, even when illness opened his eyes. Then he wrote about my mother. He called her brave. He called her the only adult in the room back then. He said he saw, too late, that my mother wasn't difficult, she was trying to save a child from a man who didn't know how to be gentle. He confessed that his second marriage was built on convenience and image. Stephanie wanted a comfortable life, and he wanted to believe comfort meant success. But when he got sick, comfort turned into cruelty, and the house became a cage with expensive furniture. He wrote that he tried to call me more than once. He would pick up the phone, stare at my name, and put it down again. "A colonel can face bullets," he wrote, "but I couldn't face my own daughter's disappointment." The letter said he followed my life from afar. He saw my name in training lists, heard about my discipline, and felt something like pride mixed with grief. "You wear the uniform better than I ever did," he wrote, "because you kept your heart." And then came the part that shattered me: "This will is my apology in the only language I ever mastered, duty." He wasn't buying love. He was transferring responsibility, like a man finally admitting he owed a debt that couldn't be repaid with medals. I sat in my hotel room and read the letter 3 times. Each time, my anger got quieter and my grief got louder. I wasn't mourning the man I knew, I was mourning the father I never got. My mother called and asked, "Are you okay?" I told her, "He left you something." She went silent, and in that silence I heard years of pain she never used as a weapon. Then she whispered, "I hope it helps you more than it helps me." Stephanie didn't stop. She sent messages through the lawyer, demanded her share, hinted at court. She spoke like the house was hers by destiny. But my father had done one thing right at the end: he planned for war when he knew peace was impossible. A week later, I returned for a final appointment with Mr. Carter. He explained the legal protections, timelines, signatures, witnesses. Listening to him, I realized my father had been methodical, like he was leading one last operation, only this time the target was his own mistakes. Mr. Carter looked at me and said, "He wanted you to know he never blamed your mother." That sentence felt like warm water on old burns. because my mother had carried that fear that maybe she was the reason he disappeared. I drove past my father's house before leaving the city. It was bigger than any place my mother and I ever lived in. I imagined Stephanie walking those rooms like a queen, and my father sitting quietly somewhere, sick and lonely, realizing that a big house can still be an empty life. I didn't feel victory. I felt responsibility. If I took what he left, it wouldn't be revenge, it would be the cost of his repentance. And if I refused it, I'd be pretending the past didn't matter. So I made a decision. I would accept the inheritance, and I would use it with intention, help my mother rest, pay her debts, and build a future that didn't repeat the same cycle. That would be my answer to my father's silence. I would turn it into something good. On the day I visited his grave, the cemetery was quiet and bright. The flag near the entrance moved slowly in the wind, like it was breathing. I stood there in uniform and realized I was not a child hiding behind a couch anymore. I knelt and placed my hand on the cold stone. "You were wrong," I said softly, "and you paid for it." Then I swallowed the hardest words of my life and spoke them anyway. "I forgive you." Not because he deserved it, but because I deserved peace. I left the cemetery feeling lighter, not happier. Some wounds don't close with apologies, they close with choices. My father's last act wasn't a grand speech, it was a careful decision that protected the two women he once abandoned. Stephanie tried one final move. A formal letter arrived, accusing my mother of turning me against my father. I read it, and for a moment the old anger tried to wake up. Then I remembered my mother's tired hands and quiet love, and I let the anger die again. I didn't answer Stephanie with cruelty. I answered with boundaries. Through the lawyer, I responded once: the will stands, the law stands, and harassment will be documented. It wasn't revenge. It was order, something my father taught me, even when he taught it wrong. Weeks later, my mother and I sat at our small kitchen table, the same place where she used to help me with homework. This time we weren't doing math. We were planning a future, one where she didn't have to fight alone anymore. I kept my father's letter in a simple folder. Not as a trophy, not as proof, just as a reminder. A reminder that people can wake up too late, and that the best revenge against that tragedy is to wake up early in your own life. I used part of the inheritance to create something my mother never had: safety. I used another part to invest in my training and my future. Because if my father's story ended with regret, mine would not. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if he had called when he still could. Maybe we would have cried. Maybe we would have fought. Maybe we would have healed sooner. But life doesn't give refunds for lost time, it only offers receipts for what we do next. If you asked me whether I got revenge, I would say no. Revenge is loud, it needs witnesses. What I got was justice, and justice is quiet, it simply puts things back where they belong. My father spent his life chasing rank, believing it would make him untouchable. In the end, the only thing that mattered was whether his daughter could say his name without shaking. That was the real legacy he left behind, one last chance to do the right thing. I still don't romanticize what he did. A letter doesn't erase a childhood. But forgiveness doesn't rewrite the past, it frees the future. And the future is where I live now. If there's one thing I learned, it's this: the most profound revenge isn't destroying someone who hurt you. It's building a life so honest and so whole that their mistakes can't reach you anymore. My father left me a house, money, and an apology. But what I chose to build with it, that part is mine.